Are there other members seeking recognition? The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
And I would ask the clerk if that amendment has been 2 hours in its gestation period.
Mr. Bond, is this number 595 at the corner?
Yes, it is. It's on electricity prices increases for residential.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Yes, sir, it is.
Then the chair recognizes the gentleman from, excuse me.
Do we want to read?
We'll wait while the amendment is, then we'll ask the clerk to report the amendment.
Okay. Amendment to H.R. 2454 offered by Mr. Blunt. After Section 2, insert the following new section. Dispense.
I think we can
Ask
dispense.
unanimous consent.
Unanimous consent that we dispense with reading.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And on this amendment, this would require the EPA administrator in consultation with the Secretary of Energy to every year prepare and certify a report to the Congress on average retail prices of electricity to residential users. If the administrator would determine that the average retail price of electricity sold to end users in the residential sector in one or more of the census divisions, and there are 9 census divisions in the country, has increased by 10% above the 2009 rates adjusted for inflation, then the provisions of the Act would cease to be effective. And so that's essentially what it does. Rather than we had the 9, I put the 9 census regions in rather than the average, because this legislation is going to impact different regions of the country, I believe, in dramatically different ways. Such different ways that you could have an overall average that didn't increase by 10%, but you could have a region that would increase by a percentage well above that. For instance, in the state of Missouri and the census region that we would be in our state, around 85% of all of the electricity is produced by coal. In California, it's 4%. So we're clearly much more dramatically impacted than some average number in the country or than other regions in the country. And so, Mr. Chairman, this just simply would say that if that increase was 10% above the current rate adjusted for inflation, then the Act ceases to be effective, and it would have to be in essentially a ninth of the country or one of the 9 census divisions.
The gentleman's time has...
And I would yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition? The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Escher.
I thank the chairman. I respect the maker of the amendment, but I'm going to speak against it because the amendment focuses on electricity rates and tries to suggest that the rates are going to skyrocket under the legislation. The substitute actually directly protects against this through allocation of allowances. Under the substitute, 39% of total allowance value goes back to consumers via the local distribution companies, which are the local electricity and natural gas providers. So that provision ensures that consumers will not see a substantial increase in their electricity and natural gas bills. Now, if there's been anything that that members in various clusters have been discussing as we were looking to shape this legislation, it was to ensure that what you are saying is going to happen will not happen. And that's why what is built into the substitute deals directly with it. And what consumers really care about at the end of the day is their electricity bills, not their rates. Not their rates. Everyone in this country knows that one bill, besides their credit card bill, their utility bill, and what they're paying. So I don't look at the fine print about what my rate is. I look to see what the total cost of my bill is. And the bill also provides really significant support to every state to retrofit old leaky buildings, that waste huge amounts of energy and money. And the bill also requires more efficient appliances, which are very important, which save money for their owner every time they're used. I've changed my appliances, and I can see the difference, not in the rate of my utility bill, but in the overall lower cost of what I pay every month. And the bill requires utilities to adopt energy efficiency programs. And so I think all of these things that are built into the legislation are directed at that once-a-month event that everyone in the country, every household experiences, and that is what the cost of their utility bill is, and speaks very clearly to that. So as I said before, I started out by saying I respect the gentleman, but I think your amendment focuses more on rates. I think it's the other way around, and how the bill actually directs itself toward keeping the costs low for consumers. Thank you.
Great.
Yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition? The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong support of the Blunt Amendment. I want to focus the committee's attention on what it specifically says. It deals only with residential electricity prices. Average retail price of electricity sold to end users in the residential sector. These are your voters. These aren't commercial users. These aren't industrial users. These are residential users, what they pay for electricity in their home. Now, the proponents of the pending bill before us can talk all they want about all these allowances to the commercial sector, the industrial sector, and specific industries. But what this says is, if the retail price you pay in your home by census region goes up more than 10% above whatever they're paying in this calendar year, adjusted for inflation, then the provisions of the Act cease to be effective. Now, if those of you that think you've got this great cap-and-trade allowance system that's going to be painless to the economy and not going to raise rates, if you really believe that, accept this amendment, because it's harmless. If retail electricity rates at your constituency at their homes don't go up more than 10% adjusted for inflation, this amendment never goes into effect. If, on the other hand, those of us that think it's going to be catastrophic to the economy and that rates are going to go up substantially, if we're right, this protects your residential consumers from that increase. It's pretty straightforward. Either we're right that this expensive cap-and-trade program is going to maybe allocate winners and losers in the industrial and commercial sector, but it's not going to protect the residential sector. If we're right, this is the amendment that protects people who pay for electricity at their homes or their condominiums or their apartments. Now, we give a 10% fudge factor. That's non-trivial. I mean, you can go up 10% and then adjust that for inflation. So we're not saying you can't have any price increase at retail, at residential, but if it goes up more than that, then the cap and trade ceases to be effective. Now, in Europe, where they've had cap and trade, their residential rates have gone up. Okay? Now, maybe my friends on the majority have designed a cap and trade program that's going to be absolutely painless. I doubt that. But if they have, this will never kick in. But if you haven't, this protects your individual consumers in their homes, apartments, and condos from having to pay because you haven't developed a cap and trade system that doesn't cost a lot of money. So I strongly support this. It is the Residential Consumer Protection Amendment, and we should support it. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll be very brief. Mr. Chairman, am I correct when we look at the allocation section on utilities, the allocations that we provide in the bill go back to the local distribution companies, and that is going to be used to deal with residential rates as well as commercial and industrial. Is that not
The
true?
gentleman is correct.
So we do address this in the bill. It's not just commercial and industrial customers that we hold harmless from this. We also hold harmless residential customers with the allocation, a rather generous one, that it goes through the LDCs and to keep these rate hikes from occurring. So I think it's dealt with adequately in the bill, and the amendment before us doesn't just say that we stop a 10% rate increase. It says that we stop our whole efforts to address climate change if it goes up. So I think this, again, once again, the bill has adequately addressed this need. It targets residential ratepayers as well as commercial and industrial, and I see no need to support the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition? The chair recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly voice my support for this amendment. And you know, a number of the hearings that we had over the last couple of months, there were a number of witnesses who said that this bill was only going to cost 13 cents a day. Well, let's make sure that it does. 10% increase, this will cover them to make sure that there's not a problem. If it's not 10%, if somehow this amendment goes down, I think we ought to do what we did with what we're going to do with Mr. Rogers' amendment. It says if China and India aren't going to agree right away, we'll give you 5 years. What percent should it be? If it's not 10, if that goes down, should it be 20? Should it be 40? Should it be 50%? Where should we draw the line so that consumers will find out whether they're taken care of or not? And there's another amendment that Mrs. Blackburn and I intend to offer a little bit later this evening, and that's to make sure that we have full transparency so that consumers know why their utility bills, why their electric bills are going up. In Michigan, we passed, our state legislature passed a renewable portfolio standard last year. And beginning in June or July, all of us consumers are going to see exactly what that cost is going to be per month. It's going to be on our bill. And yes, I'm going to look at it. And I think most consumers are going to look at it because for the average consumer in Michigan, look at Mr. Rogers here, I think it's going to go up $3.50 or $4 a month to make sure that we have the adequate deal for wind and solar and other issues there. And Michigan consumers are going to know what that cost is. So this is an amendment that lets people know just exactly what it's going to be. And if it's not going to be 10%, should we look at 20 or 50%? And I think you'll see those amendments coming forth if this amendment somehow is defeated. I yield back.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
The chair will recognize himself. Oh, I'm sorry. The chair will recognize the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Braley.
Thank you. I would just like to point out that the language as drafted would exclude all provisions of the Act if this provision would kick in at the 10% level. So that means all of the energy efficiency provisions in Title II, which have absolutely nothing to do with global warming, would be gone. It means all of the other provisions that are part of the bill moving us in a clean energy direction would be gone, regardless of whether they were part of the overall plan to combat global warming and climate change. And so that would be one of the best reasons I know of to vote against this amendment, because it's overbroad. It would go way beyond the scope of what the amendment is intended to accomplish, which is to address the impact of global warming provisions in the bill, and it would basically gut the entire Act, including many other positive benefits, and that's why I oppose it.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
And let's go beyond that. Let's just say, for the sake of the discussion, that a utility or a group of utilities began to construct nuclear power plants. And God forbid some event with the nuclear power plant occurs somewhere in the world, and as a result, nuclear power plants again are not constructed. Well, that could lead to a 10% increase in the rate base of those areas in the country that were dependent upon it. It's happened before. It could happen again. Let's say, God forbid, some international incident occurs in the Middle East that leads to a dramatic spike in energy prices. Well, that as well would be something that was not, in fact, caused by this legislation. Let's just say, for the sake of the discussion, that electric utilities, a group of them, decided to decrease their industrial electricity rates and compensate for it by increasing their residential rates. That, too, would have nothing to do with this legislation. But all of it, as the gentleman from Iowa is pointing out, would lead to a cessation of all provisions in the legislation that would be unrelated to those events. These are the same kinds of comments that were made after the 1990 Clean Air Act was passed. The same kind of comments were made about how high the rates would go. But the reality was that within the years after the Clean Air Act of 1990 passed, on average, electricity rates have fallen 19%. In fact, the electricity rates in the state of Missouri fell 59% between 1990 and the year 2006. On the other hand, the Energy Information Agency projects that electricity prices will rise 3% over the next year and 15% by 2030. So electricity prices have already gone up by 25% in the last 4 years. The status quo is not working. The real threat to consumers is that their pocketbooks could be threatened by events because we haven't put in place a new plan that would give us new sources of domestically generated electricity. So for all those reasons, I think a no vote is recommended on this amendment. I thank the gentleman from Iowa for the points which he made. And does he wish to continue or to yield back the balance of his time?
Yield back the balance of my. Yes, I'll yield.
Maybe, I don't know if you can answer the questions, but it may be better if we yield to the sponsor of the amendment. What is a census division? Is that a state?
There are 9 in the country, and they're regional.
Okay. I guess my concern is that, for example, the state of Texas, we have ERCOT, a state, it's all the state of Texas, and yet we have other utilities that serve areas across state lines, so they come under federal law. How would this work in states that, by the census division, it would be difficult to do this? And I guess my concern, too, is that does the EPA ever have the ability in consultation with anyone to modify or change something we actually pass in a rate setting situation?
Well, there would have been 2 ways really to look at this. I'd say to my good friend from Texas. One is you could just have a national average, but the problem is this is not going to have national average impact. And so what this amendment as drafted says is if in one of those 9 regions, if in essentially 1/9 of the country, you have impact beyond what this committee anticipates, that the law no longer would apply. I'd say to my friend from Iowa who controls the time, we could possibly modify this so that only Title III wouldn't apply, where you'd still have many of the sections of the bill, but you wouldn't have the Title III section. The goal here is not to throw out the entire bill, but the goal here is to be sure that residential customers have the protection that the gentlewoman from California and the gentleman from Pennsylvania said they would have, but the chairman explained all the ways that residential rates could go up. And that's what we want to avoid here, a residential setting where rates go up.
Mr. Chairman, if I could get ask for 2 more minutes for the gentleman from Iowa so we could have exchange, and that way I won't have to ask for my time.
The members hear the unanimous consent request. Without objection, 2 minutes are added to the time of the gentleman from Iowa.
To our colleague from Iowa and from Missouri, I guess my concern is by adopting this amendment, we may take it off of our responsibility, whether it's the regions or the states or as a nation. We didn't have any testimony that said we would lower rates by doing cap and trade or even a carbon tax, if that's since that's what your side wants to do. But I think this may be punted by Congress saying, oh, the EPA is supposed to take care of that. It's actually going to be our responsibility to respond, and that's why I think this amendment may be an effort to cover in the congressional responsibility if we have a substantial increase in rates. In regions, I think it's difficult I'd go down to states even, but that's our job. And so that's why I think the amendment may not be the best for this bill, because I want us to come back and revisit it on a regular basis, which I think we will over the next 10 years that's effective. And I thank my colleague from Iowa for yielding.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. I'm sorry. Gentleman from Iowa.
Well, I just wanted to comment on the gentleman from Missouri's point, and I think one of the things that's so unpredictable, and this is something that I've experienced firsthand in my first 2 terms, is we had a massive ice storm event that had an enormous impact on public utilities in my state. A year ago, we had the most powerful tornado in the country hit my district, which had an enormous impact on utilities in my state, followed by the worst flooding that we'd ever seen. And so when you break it down into these census divisions, you can't adjust for natural disasters and the regional impact that could cause these price fluctuations without any regard to the gains that are being made from the attempts to combat climate change. So that's why I am uncomfortable with the language, even in a modified form, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Great. Gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition? The chair recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Boyer.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for that purpose.
I needed to respond to my good friend, Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, earlier that you had made comment with regard that sufficient provisions were in the bill to protect consumers with regard to rate increases. And I just want the gentleman to know, I do not know the electric power portfolio with regard to Pennsylvania. I don't know what it is. I could probably look that up. But with regard to Indiana, we are about 96% coal, 0 nuclear, we're 3% natural gas, and 0.4% renewables. So we are a highly dependent state on coal. And given how the permits are being allocated 50% to the CO2 emission and 50% to retail sales, we're going to be punished in Indiana. So when permits are handed out to take a state like, according to the Edison Electric Institute, EEI, California, their portfolio, 23% nuclear, 13% large hydro, 12% renewable, 47% natural gas, 4% coal, 1% fossil fuel. So they're very, very low with regard to their emissions. Indiana is extraordinarily high with regard to our emissions. And so when you look at the allocations, what's happening is certain states are going to receive a tremendous windfall with regard to the allocation of the permits. States like Indiana, when we only get 50%, we're going to have to go out and then purchase those out onto the marketplace. And when those are purchased, that is a cost that is borne by someone. So with regard to our state, Mr. Doyle, in Indiana, it might, your comments might be helpful to a consumer in a state that has a good energy portfolio, but with regard to Indiana, we're going to get punished, and we're going to get really high rates.
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure, and I'd just like to ask the gentleman, did you take the Midwest states into consideration?
Yeah, I would just say to the gentleman, every single one of my constituents gets their electricity from coal. So the whole purpose of allocating 35% of the total pot of allocations to the electric utilities, and to take those allocations and pass those allowances down to the local distribution companies, is specifically so in states like yours and mine that are heavily dependent on coal, that these free allocations that are going to the LDCs will help mitigate these price spikes. So, I mean, this is specifically being done to help states like mine and yours against this.
Would you be more favorable if these permits were based on a 100% allocation of emissions as opposed to retail sales?
I'm not sure what you mean by that. Maybe the chair can clarify, but my understanding is 35% of the total emissions. We're talking about some $35 billion is going to flow down through the LDCs, and that's going to be used specifically to mitigate price spikes in residential, commercial, and industrial use.
Mr. Doyle, I'm referring to the permits. As those permits are allocated, they're allocated 50% based on the utilities retail sales and 50% based on the CO2 emissions for the utilities. So I'm just saying, would you be supportive then if all of your consumers are 100% coal, mine are 96% coal, that it would be a 100%, we should do a 100% allocation based on emissions instead of retail sales? That avoids this tremendous windfall to states out there?
Would the gentleman yield?
Yeah, I was going to say,
Mr. Doyle, if he would support that.
I'd like to hear clarification from staff because that's not my understanding.
If the gentleman would yield, this is a carefully crafted compromise with the Edison Electric Institute, led by Duke Power, the largest utility in Indiana, which was the utility that basically argued for this formula for your consumers. So this is Jim Rogers asking for this formula because he felt that it was best, and he was reflecting on Indiana when he was asking for it. So we were deferring here to the Indiana utility as it would then relate to the local distribution, as it would relate to the consumers of...
Reclaiming my time, I would submit that Jim Rogers does not speak for the consumers in Indiana. I'll yield back.
Are there other members seeking recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
On this side? We'll turn and recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Radonovich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the time, and I too rise in strong support of this amendment. We did have a hearing before this began, and former Vice President Al Gore, the main proponent of this legislation, was testifying before the committee and said that we would be able to essentially move from fossil fuels to a reliance on solar and wind energy, enhance the economy, and reduce dependence on foreign oil, all at 33 cents per household per day. And I find that hard to believe. I think that we've heard estimates that the real cost of this thing per household could be anywhere between $2,500 to $4,500 per year. And I kind of look at this as more of a put your money where your mouth is amendment. If this bill does accomplish all that it does, the last thing I know that my friends on the other side of the aisle would want to do would be to raise rates, residential rates and rates to consumers. But there's a large body of evidence and a lot of people that believe that if you're trying to replace the fossil fuel industry with solar and wind and a few other things without identifying a new energy resource, the impact is going to be place a heavy burden on the economy and the individual consumer. So I think that it ought to be in everybody's interest on this committee to begin to look to ways to ensure safeguards in there that when prices to consumers rise as a result of this legislation, I think we need to be far less worried about a nuclear accident or any other national or world catastrophe that's going to raise rates, because this bill and the effects of cap and trade are going to do it for them. And everybody ought to be on board on devising some type of a system that speaks for the residential mom and dad in their house paying the electric bills that are going to increase 300 or 400% as a result of legislation like this. So I would hope that the issuer of the amendment and folks on the other side, if you want to tailor this to make it work, I think it's all in the best interest of the American people to be protected from this kind of legislation that's going to come down of them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition on the majority side? Then we'll turn back again to the minority side and recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong support of this amendment. I have been in contact with our Public Utility Commission in Pennsylvania as to their thoughts on this legislation, and they are so concerned they've requested to meet with our congressional delegation and are coming down to do that, but they provided us written analysis a couple of weeks ago of this legislation, and they concluded that this would result in a sizable hike in the electric bills of residential customers, among other things. I won't read all of them, but that's a direct quote. They say that they're far from convinced that the negative impacts of this legislation could have on our state's economy are fully understood and appreciated. And the cost estimates are staggering. Take, for example, the recent study conducted for PJM, that's the Regional Transmission Organization, the RTO, to which Pennsylvania belongs, that provides an assumed cost of $60 per short ton of CO2 emission allowances. By year 2013, they said this would result in an annual PJM-wide market impact of nearly $36 billion in higher energy prices and rate increases of over $400 annually for residential ratepayers. And whether we reach the $60 per short ton figure or not, the impact will likely be a nightmare for regulators. Pennsylvania is the fourth largest coal producer in the nation. They distribute over 75 million tons of coal each year. Roughly 7% of our nation's coal supply is in Pennsylvania, and 58% of all of our electricity in Pennsylvania comes from coal. So I think we need to listen to experts. These are the ones in our state who are dealing with these electricity rates and the minutia of them on a daily basis. They're recommending.
Will the gentleman yield?
And yes, I'm sorry.
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I also met with Commissioner Powelson. I didn't meet with the other, and Joe and I had talked about having a meeting for the Pennsylvania delegation with our PUC to discuss the legislation. One of the things that came out in my meeting with Commissioner Powelson is that they were basing this report on the draft. They were not knowledgeable nor had seen the chairman's substitute. So a lot of these points that were of concern to them have been addressed in the bill. So what we've agreed to do is have a meeting with our PUC after this markup so that they have the benefit of seeing that the changes that have been incorporated in the bill, and they can reanalyze the draft. And I look forward to hearing their comments once they've been able to see this. But the report that you speak of, and it's the same thing Powelson said to me, was based on the draft, and he had no knowledge of the revisions that were made.
Reclaim my time. I still, after talking to Powelson and the Democrats, not just the Republican, both sides on the PUC, have a belief that this will have dramatic impacts on our residential rates. And I look forward to the meeting as well. But I think a vote for this amendment will protect our consumers against significant increases in our residential electric rates, and I urge support for it.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition? The chair recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Markey. First of all, I have two documents, one identified as Mid-America Calculations of Actual Allowances Allocated by Waxman Markey, which is their review of the chairman's substitute draft that was provided to public and members Thursday afternoon. The second document is entitled Estimated Cost Impacts of H.R. 2454 on OPPD's generating system and its retail customers. I'd like to submit both those for the record. No objections, so ordered.
Without objection, it will be included in the record.
I'd like to read a few paragraphs of Mid-America's analysis of the substitute that was provided on Thursday. Mid-America's CEO and I met and talked over the weekend. He is a resident of my district, although it serves most of Iowa, so within a few miles of my house. OPPT represents my constituents or provides electricity to my constituents. Very quickly, a few of the paragraphs from Mid-America. First, the methodology used for allocating electricity industry allowances is not based on total economy-wide U.S. emissions in 2005, which according to the EIA was 7.2 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. If we use the 35% figure agreed upon, the electric industry would have been allocated approximately 2.5 billion allowances. Instead, the bill uses a formula that allocates allowances from the total allowance pool of capped industries. That's an important distinction. Then on page 407 of the bill, you will see the table that gives annual allowance amounts for this pool. In 2012, the figure is 4.6 billion allowances. 1% is skimmed off the top for strategic reserve allowances, which increases to 2% in 2020. Then the bill further prescribes that the industry will receive 43.75 of the approximately 4.6 billion allowances in 2012. In other words, slightly over 2 billion allowances. Where that 43.75 figure comes is not clear. That 2 billion allowance figure is a 16% reduction from the 2.4 billion tons of CO2 emitted by the electric power sector in 2005 as measured by the EIA. So it's accurate to say that electric power industry is not getting 90% of the allowances for free. By the way, the allowance allocation for merchant coal generation is subtracted from the 2 billion, as well as an unknown amount for long-term power purchase agreements. Whatever is left, which will be well below 2 billion allowances, is distributed to local distribution companies based on a formula of historic emissions. Going through the entire package, they estimate that their 2012 costs are $900 million. OPPD, again, that generates electricity for my constituents, estimates that the draft that was provided on Thursday afternoon, again sitting down with a team of lawyers, their estimate is that $54 million in 2012 and increasing to $410 million a year by 2030 in their most optimistic case. Estimated costs based on more realistic EPA assumptions have OPPD costs ranging from $173 million a year in 2012 and increasing to $1.3 billion a year in 2030. OPPD makes the point that that's just on the cap and trade, the allowance section. This doesn't even count the increased cost to meet the renewable electricity portfolio or standard. With that, I yield back.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition at this time? Chair sees no one on the majority. We look to the minority, and I will recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, there's two great quotes, I think, on this. One was the now President of the United States when he said that the cap and trade bill would, quote, necessarily skyrocket electricity rates, end quote. My friend Mr. Doyle, who stepped out, good friend of mine, also said, even in the conversation, that they hope that these allocations would serve to, quote, mitigate price spikes. It is very clear to anyone who reads the language that electricity prices are going up because of this. In Michigan, and Mr. Upton brought up a great example, not only do we have an RPS fee that's going to be associated with every bill in the state of Michigan, but both of the companies went in, and one asked for an 11% increase, and the other is an 18% increase, and both are before our public commissions today. 11 and 18% increases on their, and on top of that, a renewable portfolio standard fee that's going to be charged to every consumer at the end of the month. 1 in 3 Michigan families are behind over 30 days in their electricity bill. 1 in 3. 1 in 3. What this bill says is we're just not going to crush you. We know you guys can't have big fancy lobbyists and who help negotiate the bill and can discuss very complicated allocations of 35% that really don't mean 35%, that deal with future contract purchases and the fluctuating price. They don't care. They know that they got a refrigerator that they have to have electricity to keep their food cold and fresh for their family. They know that when their kids get on the computer, it costs them more money to do their homework. That's what they know. And they know that they just want somebody somewhere to stand up and say, hey, what about me? What about the little guy? I'm having a hard time making my house payment, and I'm, as the statistics show, 1 in 3 houses can't even make their electric bill payment on time. And all we're asking is give them a break, please. Don't do this to them. Because if the whole idea of cap and trade works, you've got to make it more expensive. And these companies can't absorb it all. They've got to find new ways to invest in alternative forms of energy. So if that's what you want, it has to be more expensive. And consumers have to pay for it. We talk about billions of dollars. Where do you think it's coming from? Well, we're going to borrow it from China to try to give to the utility company that has a guaranteed rate of return. Anybody think that's a good idea? And the person who gets up every day and is trying to make his job or her job work, who gets her kids on the bus and drives to work and just hopes at the end of the day somebody's thinking about them because they weren't in the room, I'll guarantee you that. And if you got in the room, you got taken care of. If you weren't in the room, sorry, you're going to pay for this thing. This has real consequences for real families. And all this is an insurance marker. If you believe what you say, this bill means nothing. This amendment means nothing. It won't be a problem. But if you don't, and you do worry that the President of the United States was right when he said electric bills will skyrocket, and my good friend Mr. Doyle said that they're going to have to mitigate spiking prices, okay. I don't think the intention here is wrong, but let's build in a little protection for the little guy, the person who's still trying to build something in America, who's still trying to make their truck payment and their electric bill payment, and try to figure out after all of that, after their 401k is now a 101k, how do they get their kids through school? This is the wrong time to not protect the little guy who's trying to pay these bills.
The gentleman yield?
I will yield. Yes, sir.
I mean, the biggest chunk of allocation, not auction, is specifically going to these distribution companies to pass through to ratepayers so that the things that you're talking about don't happen.
But would the gentleman yield?
Well, let me just reclaim my time. It's very clear, and Mr. Terry did a fantastic job of going through how the 35% really isn't even 35%. And it's submitted for the record. I'll give you a copy of it. And that's the problem when you get all these complicated allocations for people who, this corporation gets this allocation, and if you build this, you get this allocation. And electricity producing companies, you're going to get this based on this with this formula. And I'll tell you what all of that complication means. It means the guy who's paying the electric bill is going to get the shaft. That's what that means. And that's what it clearly spelled out when they broke down the allocation. That's why because it's based on nothing. You've created this allocation cap based on what you think is right. That's the problem. It's not based on real science. You picked a cap, and then you broke a pot of money, and then you decided you were going to take 35%, and oh, by the way, here are the exceptions to that 35% and how you can spend it, and they go to the PUC and say, we're losing money, we're guaranteed a rate of return, you have to pay the bill at the end of the day. That's why just give them the insurance. That's all I'm asking. Please give these people the insurance they need.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition on the majority side? All right, we'll turn again to the minority and recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we proceed on this, and I've been looking at, I believe someone made a comment about this being equivalent to the rate of a postage stamp, which, by the way, that per day comes out to about $156 a year, not including costs of goods made in the United States that are also going to be added to that as well. And I guess that doesn't assume that costs of postage stamps have gone up a third in the last 10 years, 33%. Overall, a part of this we have to understand is, and I want to make sure you have this, if steel mills are being hurt by production, they get some money back. And if families get hurt by this, they get some money back. This reminds me of the great comedian Jonathan Winters. Some years ago, he was oftentimes challenged with being shown a photograph, and he had to make up a joke about it. And they handed him this picture of the Eiffel Tower. And Jonathan Winters said, this is a picture of something they built in Paris so they could put a red light on top of so that planes wouldn't crash into it. And I wonder how this cycle goes and how we explain this to constituents, that we're taking the money away from you so that we can give it back to you at another rate, and that's going to, I mean, it begins to lose it for folks too. I mean, the bottom line comes down to this, that we're still saying we're having to defend a position here where we want to have clean energy. I don't think there's any question on that, but I still wonder about these tax increases and other increases that are taking place here that are going to be a burden back on every family in terms of paying their electric bill, paying more for goods and services of anything made in this country, and that has to be something that we're going to have problems explaining to our constituents. And I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there any members on the majority side? The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Stupak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd yield you my time.
I thank the gentleman for yielding to me. And it's been some time since we made these points, so I will make the points again, just so that they're introduced from the majority side into the debate. This proposal that we are working from is endorsed by and supported by the Edison Electric Institute, and that includes AEP, Duke Energy, NRG, Xcel, Exelon, Constellation, PG&E, on and on. But it also happens to have the benefit of being supported by NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. It also has the benefit of being endorsed by the National Association of State Consumer Advocates, consumer side as well. It also happens to be a formula that's endorsed by the Center for Budget Priorities. Those are the people that spend their time trying to figure out how things like this impact ordinary people and their homes. So we've worked very hard, and they all support this proposal because they believe that it does accomplish the goal of protecting consumers. I don't think that we had EEI endorsing anything or supporting anything back in 1990 or 1978 or 1970 when we were going through earlier iterations of the of the Clean Air Act until, unless and until they're completely satisfied. And so just for the record, okay, this proposal supposes something that would not have been thought through by, in each state, the kind of interests here that have a stake in keeping electricity rates stable. And I think that Mr. Doyle has done a good job over and over again in remaking this point, ensuring that everyone understands that Mr. Boucher, along with many other members, spent a lot of time with the affected utilities, but also the state regulatory commissioners and others, ensuring that this formula was a workable one and would, as the gentleman said, make sure that we would not see spiking electricity rates. So I just introduced that once again so that the members can hear it, and my time has expired, and I will now seek to recognize...
Gentleman yield.
43 seconds.
If I may rescind my sending back my time, and there is no objection, then I will yield to the gentleman from Missouri.
Well, I'll try to be quick in my 32 seconds. I thank my friend for yielding. There has to be, if the gentleman's right, if the chairman's right, if there is no impact, then I don't see the harm of the amendment. If there is an impact, I don't think the person that gets a utility bill and we say, well, the consumer advocates thought this would be good, and the regulators thought this would be good, and the power company thought this would be good, I don't think that's going to be a very good answer to that person. So there has to be some percentage where surely this committee would be willing to say if the rate goes up at some level, we'd be willing to do something. I said we could make it apply to only Title III. We're willing to work here, but this is a problem that you say won't be a problem. We say if it's not a problem, what's wrong with coming up with a safe solution? I thank the gentleman.
If I may reclaim my time and just to briefly say that the gentleman from Pennsylvania has already pointed out that those anticipated spikes won't be as a result of this bill. However, they could be as a result of other events that do occur. Those are the types of events that the gentleman from Iowa was making reference to. A litany that I went down as well, but it won't be because of this bill, but then because of some other catastrophic event that occurred it could lead to a suspension of the entire bill, and that's the problem with the gentleman's amendment. My time has expired, and I will now turn to the minority to look for other members who are seeking recognition. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. And this is an important debate. Because of deregulation in the electric utilities in Illinois, we actually saw a huge public outcry. So much that they forced the state legislature to go back and, in essence, rescind some of the legislation. So this could very well happen here. This is an insurance policy. I concur with my colleagues that says if you are right, no harm, no foul. But if you are wrong, as we call for a vote on this amendment, you're going to be on record saying, no, we're not going to rescind this bill if electricity costs go up 15% or 20%, or what they did in Illinois, 30 and 50%. Now, votes have consequences, and that's the side that you all want to be on, but let's talk about the caps provision. When Mr. Boucher originally put the counter proposal on what the caps would be, they were to be 40%, which would be 100% of the CO2 emissions. Well, guess what, gang? He didn't get 40%. He only got 35. So there's already 5% of the credits that are going to be pushed on to a rate hike somewhere because it doesn't cover all the emissions. The draft already talks about it's only 90%. It's not 100%. It's not. So how is the additional 10% going to be passed on? It's going to be passed on through higher cost. And this is a protection to keep that from happening to the individual electricity user. Now, Mr. Terry, in his analysis, correctly identifies that the 35% is really not a 35%. So the question is, what is the percent? And if it's not 35, what is it? So then you take the original proposal of 40%, which was the Boucher counter, by golly, we're going to get 40%. We're going to cover electricity generators and make sure that the cost price. Then he sold out for 35. Now you check the fine print, and 35 is not 35. All we're saying is you better have yourself covered. And you better have yourself covered with your electric utility rate payers. And this is a 10%. I mean, it gives you room for some increase in utility rates. Up to 10%. I would think that anything over 10% would be egregious, and we ought to relook at the bill. Now, if you all don't think that a 10% increase in utility rates is not bad for your consumers or your constituents, then I would invite you to rural, poor Southern Illinois. As I said in my opening statements, this bill disproportionately harms the poor. They're not buying new generation refrigerators. They're not buying new generation washer and dryers. They're traveling long distances. So any increase in electricity rates hurts the poor. And I'm actually really surprised that the Democrat Party that espouses the fight for the little guy are fighting for the big guy in this bill. You're fighting for the big guys. Big electric, big utilities, EEI, by golly. Where's Big Steel? All the big guys. Who's fighting for the little guy? Well, you know who is? We are, because we have a simple amendment that says if electricity rates go over 10%, we ought to relook at this bill.
Will the gentleman yield?
I would be happy to yield.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding. I really don't know what the Democratic majority, what their fear of the Blunt Amendment is. I mean, it calls for increase by more than 10%, then the provisions of this act shall cease to be effective. I'm thinking back on Medicare modernization and the Prescription Drug Act. We had a provision in that bill concerned over increased cost of Part D, that if the overall spending on Medicare reached 45%, threshold, then the president would have to immediately notify Congress, and Congress would have to, within a very short period of time, take action to bend that growth curve, to bring that down, because it would be unsustainable. My colleagues, I think I remember shortly after Madam Speaker became Madam Speaker, that this very thing happened. The president notified the Congress and the new majority, the Democratic majority, that more than 45% out of the general treasury was now paying for the tab on Medicare, and not nearly enough coming out of Part B. And the Speaker, as I recall, just simply ignored that provision. So let's pass this amendment, and then you would have the opportunity, assuming that she's still Speaker, of once again ignoring it. And I'll yield back to my colleague from Illinois.
Gentleman yields back his time. I think we've had enough debate on this amendment. Are we ready for the vote? How many members wish to still speak on this amendment? 1, 2, 3. Would you be willing to do 3 minutes each? Okay, how about the others of you? Will you do 3 minutes each? 3?
I would prefer to take my full 5 minutes, if I may, please, sir.
Okay, let's go in order of seniority. Mr. Burgess.
Thank you. And
We point out, after the 3 of you, we're going to move to vote.
And Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I would like to ask a question of counsel.
Your time.
Thank you. I'm concerned about the consumer protections that we've been hearing so much about, and I can't find in the bill, and maybe you can help me, where does it say that the consumers will actually get money from the rate payers, from the distributors, rather, in this allocation scheme?
Section 783 says it with respect to the local district.
Give me a page number if you would. I've got so many bills in front of me, I don't know where I am. I'm just a simple country doctor.
Well, first of all, you're in the Commerce Committee room, in the Rayburn House
Yeah,
Office building.
Thank you for that.
No. This is LDCs.
Can you give me the page number and the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Section 783 of the Clean Air Act is on page 566.
Okay, I'm with you. So the climate change consumer refund account is what you're referencing?
If the gentleman, is it on page 553 that we're talking about? Is 553 the page that has the
But page 553 has
Yes.
section 782, which does say on line 3 and 4 that it shall be allocated for the benefit of electricity consumers.
And how does the money actually get to the consumer?
That's in section 783. Yes, but that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the distribution, termination of emissions, updating. And then on page 574, paragraph 4, use of allowances, heading over to page 575, it says that emission allowances shall be used exclusively for the benefit of retail ratepayers of such electricity local distribution company.
Again, how does the money actually get to the consumer? Through the distribution company?
Yes, that's up to the distribution company to
It's
determine.
up to the distribution company. Are they compelled to give it?
If the council would yield, it's up to the local public utility commission to ultimately make that determination.
Can the Public Utility Commission be actually forced to turn that money over to the consumer?
In paragraphs A, B, and C, it directs the local distribution companies in terms of how they are to use the allowances. It requires that they be used for the benefit of retail ratepayers. Paragraph B says that they have to ensure that the benefits are distributed among ratepayer classes ratably based on electricity deliveries to each class, and then in little clause 2, equitably among individual ratepayers within each ratepayer class. And then C provides some further limitations and direction on how the allowances are to be used and how the benefit is to go to the consumers. And then paragraph D requires the administrator to prescribe specific guidelines.
Can you tell me what the direct effect on a ratepayer in the state of Texas would be, since Texas is a non-regulated state?
No, I can't tell you what the direct effect on ratepayers in Texas would be. It would be up to the LDCs and the LDCs in Texas that are regulated by the state.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now go to the Ms.
Well, Mr.
Blackburn.
Chairman, this is an important point. Can I ask for an additional 2 minutes here?
Objection is heard. But you can ask questions other than doing it in a public setting if you want information. We'll be glad to have our staff answer questions for you if that would be helpful. Ms. Blackburn, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman will state his parliamentary inquiry.
We have a pending amendment, which I believe is the Blunt Amendment, and every member of the committee that wishes to is under the rules of the committee is allowed 5 minutes to comment pro or con on that amendment. We also have a standing practice that members can strike the requisite number of words to ask questions of counsel. As I understand it, and I may be wrong because I wasn't in the room, Dr. Burgess was asking questions of counsel. Is that not correct? So technically that shouldn't count against his 5 minutes of commenting on the pending amendment.
As I understand it, we've been talking about this amendment, and I have not been in the room the full time, but over an hour and 15, 20 minutes. Not everybody has to say everything about every matter, because we need to move on.
Well, but this is an important thing.
It is important indeed.
This is the guts of the bill.
So you think that Mr. Burgess ought to have additional time?
I think every member of the committee on both sides of the aisle should have sufficient time to ask questions of counsel about the bill, and I also think every member should be given, if they wish it, 5 minutes to comment on any amendment that's before the committee.
Well, we're not going to do 10 minutes per person.
Well, but you got two different issues, Mr. Chairman.
Members have 5 minutes to use as they see fit. I think we ought to give Mr. Burgess another couple of minutes, and then we'll recognize the other two members on your side of the aisle that seek time. And then I'd like to put the question to the members to limit the debate and move on.
I thank the chair for the consideration. I'll just point out, had we had a chance to do this in subcommittee, maybe some of these things could have been resolved. Section C, where it says limitation, an electricity local distribution company shall not use the value of emission allowances distributed under this subsection to provide to any ratepayer a rebate that is based solely on the quantity of electricity delivered. And Mr. Rogers asked a very valid question about who is looking out for the ratepayer in this, who's looking out for the end user. And it looks as if the language in this bill explicitly denies the ability to look out for the end user. The other question that is unresolved at this point is what happens as these amounts are ratcheted down 40 years from now, it's less than a third of the amount of carbon that can be emitted that is allowed in 2012. This is an important point, and it's going to affect ratepayers and end users for certainly the rest of my natural lifetime and well into the next several generations if something isn't done about this. And right now is the time to fix it and get it right. The Blunt Amendment would do that and allow the ratepayer to be spared the burden that we're going to be putting on them in years to come. And I thank the chairman for the consideration. I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burgess. Ms. Blackburn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do think this is an important discussion that we are having. We did not have time in subcommittee to go through this bill, nor did we get the bill in time to contact council and ask some of these questions. So, Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, we're left to being able to ask questions that our constituents want to have answers to right here in committee. And I appreciate getting the time to ask some of those questions. And I am in support of Mr. Blunt's amendment. I think that it is an imperative, and it is absolutely beyond me that I am hearing from some of you, we can't do anything that would stop the work we need to do on climate change. You are addressing climate change as if it is the Holy Grail. What we are trying to help you with is the fact that constituents and taxpayers are saying someone needs to put some roadblocks and some timelines and some check and balances into this legislation, because the way it is carrying out now is there is not going to be anything to stop these rates going forward. Looking at the language that we have just looked at and that council is not able to clarify for us, whether you're looking at section 783 or whether you are over on pages 575 and 576, the American taxpayer is going to see you coming to their pocket time and time and time and time again in order to pay for this bill. This bill obviously is not about making energy more affordable and more abundant. It is about climate change and about the environment. This bill is not about having cleaner energy, more accessible and more affordable for our constituents. It is about making it harder to get and more expensive. I've got a chart that the Rural Electric Cooperative Association did. If you have not looked at this thing, you need to take a look at it. It shows you what is going to happen to rates of rural electric power users in this country once this bill is passed. Now, Mr. Blunt's amendment says, look, if it goes more than 10%, and with all due respect to some of my colleagues, I can tell you people do look at what happens to their rates. And they know that when that rate goes up, they've got to flip that light switch off when they leave that room. So they do pay attention to this. But it shows you that in Tennessee, the rates are expected to go up 17%. This is on this chart, and this is with the auction and $20 a ton cost of CO2. These are their estimates. In Missouri, 23%. North Dakota, 26%. Utah, 28%. So what is wrong with saying, look, this is going to be the little roadblock in here. This is going to be the check and balance. If it goes more than 10%, maybe the steps that are being taken on behalf of climate change need to be addressed, and we need to look at what is going to happen for the consumers. As we have just heard in the limitations, there is not, if I was understanding council correctly, and I will yield back to council for them to go back and review this again. As we started on page 575 and read these limitations to you, you cannot go back. There is not a protection for the individual ratepayer in this bill. And Mr. Chairman, I think that it is going to be necessary for us to make certain that we put protections in this so that we don't see electric rates do what the President said they were going to do, which is to necessarily skyrocket. And Mr. Burgess, I will yield to you the balance of my time for further conversation with legal counsel.
Well, let me just use the brief remaining time. May I ask a question of council on the limitations paragraph that I just read? Am I understanding that correctly, that no money will be used to protect the ratepayer?
No, that is not correct. The limitation on the limitation on page 575 says that allowances distributed shall not be used to provide a rebate based solely on the quantity of electricity delivered to such ratepayer. It goes on page.
Let me just ask you then, because just a simple question: how will it be allocated? What is the formula that's going to be used? Where can my constituents go and find that information out?
It goes on page 576 to say, to the extent that the electricity local distribution company uses the value of allowances to provide rebates, it shall, to the maximum extent practicable, provide such rebates with regard to the fixed portion of ratepayers' bills or as a fixed credit or rebate on electricity bills.
So it is entirely up to the electricity distribution company then to make that assignment and assign that value.
The electricity distribution companies are all required to use allowances for the benefit of ratepayers. The electricity distribution companies are regulated by state public utility commissions, which are there to protect consumers.
But in a state like Texas, without a public utility commission, how are my constituents going to be protected, or how would they see that refund come to them?
The LDC, in conjunction with the Public Utility Commission, will be required to see that the benefit goes back to the ratepayers.
Time has expired. I will recognize
that this section is not clear.
Mr. Burgess, you had 5 minutes. You had additional 2 minutes. You had additional time, and it's Mr. Scalise's turn. And I'm going to yield him full 5 minutes. And if he doesn't use it, he can yield it to you. But I think it's only fair that other members have a chance too, on your side of the aisle as well. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's clear that the sections of this bill that deal with ratepayer assistance are very unclear, very questionable whether or not consumers will actually see any real tangible benefit in terms of offsetting the large increases they're going to get on their utility bills. And I rise in strong support of Mr. Blunt's amendment, because I think this is the only real protection that we've got in place in this bill so that consumers don't get literally forced to have to shut off their utilities. During the summer in South Louisiana, it gets pretty hot. And if you tell some senior citizen on a fixed income that once we get past 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they're going to have to shut off their air conditioning because they just can't afford to keep running the air conditioning anymore. I'll tell you what, you don't want to have to get the security forces out here you're going to have to take to get all of those senior citizens and people in walkers coming up here telling you what they think about that kind of provision if you don't give them protection. And so if you look at the language in this amendment, if all of my friends on the other side are correct, this won't be a problem, because we'll never get to a 10% increase because they're saying everybody's going to be okay. But I think what they're not telling you is everybody's not going to be okay. And you don't have to take my word or their word for it. Just take the president's word. President Obama said, under his plan, under my plan, this is a quote from President Obama, under my plan of a cap and trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. Skyrocket. And then you take his budget director. Mr. Orzog said that according to his testimony, American families on average would pay about $1,300 more in utility costs per year. $1,300. And by the way, that's the low estimate. Many organizations that have done analysis of cap and trade come up with even higher numbers. But let's take the president's own budget director, the low number, $1,300 a year more families will pay in higher utility rates under this bill. Just a few weeks ago, the new CBO director, Douglas Elmendorf, testified.
Mr. Chairman, the committee's not in order. The gentleman from Louisiana deserves the right to be heard.
Gentleman's correct. The committee will please come to order. Gentleman may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The new Congressional Budget Office director testified just a few weeks ago, and I quote, a cap and trade program would lead to higher prices for energy and energy-intensive goods. And so with all of that, Mr. Chairman, all we have before us is an amendment that says if the rates skyrocket to the point where it's more than 10% over the numbers it was at before, that this terminates. That we say enough is enough, because families will be saying enough is enough. Unfortunately, they don't have the protections. They didn't have all of these.
Is your mic still on?
Will the gentleman yield? Will the gentleman yield? Back here.
How about yielding to me? I don't know who's asking you.
Will the gentleman yield, Mr. Scalise? Radonovich?
You might want to yield to the chairman because he might give you more time.
Could we suspend the clock until we at least get our colleagues' mic working?
Yes, he has 2 minutes. We'll let him have 2 minutes.
I think you've blown it up.
It's been capped.
There is a provision in the bill that if a mic goes out by a member, then the whole bill is not in effect any longer. Yes, yes. Is there another microphone that someone would allow you to use? You're welcome.
You probably kicked it loose underneath. Sometimes.
If I may.
Mr. Scalise, I will set the clock. You have 2 minutes.
The top row's working. Come up. You can use mine if nobody else is.
See, now I'm finding out just how important seniority is around this place. Anyway, wherever I left off when the microphone cut out, I do think that the reason that we need this amendment is because this is the only real protection that regular American taxpayers, the ratepayers out there have. The senior citizen on a fixed income is not going to be able to understand why their rates go up 15%. If their utility rates necessarily skyrocket, they don't have the luxury of saying, well, I'll just pay another $130 this month because my average utility rate is going to go up $1,300 a year. They don't have that luxury. And so then they're going to be forced, like what we've dealt with health care. The reason we need health care reform, there are a lot of reasons, but one reason is you've got senior citizens out there that literally have to make the choice between getting their prescription medication or running their air condition during the summer or their heating bill, heat during the winter. And so you're going to give them one more tough choice like that where they can't afford these higher utility rates. And so what they're going to have to do is sit down and make a decision. Do I actually run the air condition in the summer when it's 110 degrees with humidity, or do I just turn it off because of this cap and trade energy tax that somebody thought was a great idea, and I'll just have to do without something else that I can't do without? We need to give them this protection. That's what this amendment is for. So I would urge support, and I would yield the balance of my time to Mr. Vodanovich.
Thank you, Mr. Scalise. I do want to, it's really important to say that the rates, we're talking about the rates to payers. We're talking about their electric bill, their gas bill, and the gentleman from Pennsylvania mentioned about how they'd be protected if that's the case. But it's way beyond that, because the increase of gas and natural gas is going to have a huge impact on the price of food, the price of clothing, the price of toys, the cost of construction of homes, the price for school books. None of this takes into account what we're talking about here. It's all over and above protecting the ratepayer from electricity and their electric and their their utility bills. And so we're not even making a dent in what the impact is going to be on the households. I would think this is the least we could do, is to make sure that their rates don't go higher than what the Blunt Amendment allows. But keep in mind that the impact to the consumer is going to go far beyond their utility bills. It's going to increase in cost to them in every manner in which they live in that household that the energy is delivered to. So I appreciate that time and yield back.
Time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, move to strike the last word.
Gentleman has spoken on this issue, I believe. Have you?
No, I have not.
You have not spoken.
Not on this one. I think I have on the others, but.
Okay. Well, we're going to recognize a Democrat first, then, and then we'll come to you. And
That's fair.
And I hope it will conclude the debate.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, can I have a point of personal privilege for 30 seconds?
Yes, gentlemen.
The chairman has been very generous in offering to provide food for both sides, and I'm very supportive of that. We found out that the food that we were provided are cucumber sandwiches. Now, I know we're politically correct, Mr. Chairman, but I'm going to order Popeye's chicken for both sides. And if there's some undecided Democrats, I hope you keep that in mind. You know, if
the gentleman's very, very generous, and we did provide sandwiches for both sides. And I know we have sandwiches other than cucumber sandwiches, although I know you like to be healthy on your side of the aisle. But we'll make sure that you have the same thing we have, and members, I hope will find something that will suit their appetites. I understand that Mr. Barton, not realizing we were going to provide food for both sides, has already purchased dinner for his side. So you do have choices over there.
And I'm going to purchase dinner tomorrow night for both sides.
Well, we accept that, and
it will not be cucumber.
and we may then provide the breakfast for Wednesday morning, midnight snack. Members who wish to partake of food, get there before the staffs do, because there won't be anything left if they get it first. Okay, Chair wishes to recognize himself, and I will do it in 3 minutes. Yield myself 3 minutes. The bill that's before us provides for an allocation of permits to the utilities for the purpose of holding the ratepayers, protecting the ratepayers from increases in costs for their electric utilities. And we think we have protected the ratepayers in that way. But if we adopt this amendment that's before us, it provides that if the rates for utilities go up 10% in any year, the whole bill is no longer in effect. Now, can you imagine a business person in this country who's going to rely on the terms of this legislation for investments? They want to know what the rules are going to be. And the rules say to them, we want more investment in renewables. We want more investment in clean energy. We want people to go out and be entrepreneurs and figure out ways to hold down the costs overall and still achieve the limits on the carbon emissions. We want to become more self-sufficient in energy. We want to transform our economy with more jobs. You can't do that from year to year where the law will either be in effect or not in effect. We already had a proposal that if China and India didn't adopt the same stringent requirements, poof, the law is no longer in effect. We have a similar amendment here. If electricity rates go up 10%, no longer in effect. That is not the way to make sound policy, in my view. We have disagreements, but it's not, in my view, not a way to make sound policy. You cannot set in motion a plan to make us more independent, to bring about greater jobs, to work on new ways to hold down costs and produce the results we want by having it in effect one year and not in effect another year. So I would urge, without even taking up the full 3 minutes I allotted to myself, that this amendment be rejected. And I now want to recognize the gentleman from Oregon, and I will recognize him for 5 minutes or 3 minutes. Which does he want?
Well, I'll make you a deal. You recognize me for 5, and I'll go for 3.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes to use as
I think that is my right under the rules.
All.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I think you make a very valid point. I actually was in small business for 21 years and 8 months. In the radio business, as you know, we paid fairly substantial electricity rates to run the transmitters. The way I read the limitation may be a little different than some of my colleagues. Limitation on page 575, sub C, limitation says an electricity local distribution company shall not use the value of emission allowances distributed under this subsection to provide to any ratepayer a rebate that's based solely on the quantity of electricity delivered to such ratepayer. So that's a disconnect from the amount of electricity you use from the rebate. It's decoupling, correct? I'd ask counsel. That's the common term, decoupling, correct?
That's not the definition of decoupling. What the bill says is that the value provided to the ratepayer shall not be based solely on the quantity of
the electricity
delivered to the ratepayer.
So you're disconnecting. Well, I'll make the case, and I won't ask you the question. How's that? The bottom line is you are disconnecting from the rebate from the amount of electricity consumed.
Correct. It cannot be, a rebate cannot be based solely on that.
And so then what it does, it says to the extent an electricity local distribution company uses the value of emissions allowances distributed under this subsection provide rebates, it shall to the maximum extent practicable provide such rebates with regard to the fixed portion of the ratepayer's bills or as a fixed credit or rebate on electricity bills. So in other words, we are disconnecting from the amount of electricity you consume when it comes to this rebate and saying we're going to the maximum extent possible, just put a flat rebate back, regardless of the amount of electricity consumed. You cannot use as the sole discretion the amount of electricity consumed. That's correct.
To the extent the allowances are used for rebates, that is correct.
That is correct. And so, in my opinion, you are now creating a much different cost basis out there. If you are a small business and you are in a rate situation where the distribution company is going to issue rebates, it's going to come back on a flat rate, not based on the amount of electricity I use. They cannot use electricity as the sole determinant.
It cannot be the sole amount of electricity cannot be.
And in fact, the language goes on to say that it shall to the maximum extent practicable provide such rebates with regard to the fixed portion of the ratepayer's bills. Says that.
Yes, correct.
So the statute here is encouraging that, saying to the maximum extent practicable, you're going to give a flat rebate back. And so from my perspective, this is a small business job killer provision that doesn't treat small business fairly, because it says you're just going to get we're going to spread this out evenly over everybody regardless how much electricity you use. And if you're in business and you're producing widgets or radio waves, you're going to use more electricity than if you're sitting at home. And I believe this is going to drive up energy costs disproportionately on small businesses, and it will hurt rural communities and jobs. I yield back.
If the council would still have an opportunity to respond.
Yes, under paragraph B, this is on page 575, it is, the LDC is required to distribute the benefits among ratepayer classes ratably. So a small business is unlikely to be in the same ratepayer class as a homeowner.
Now, is that true across the board?
It will be. It will
in every state?
The way that the PUCs and the LDCs have set up the way the PUCs have set up the rate structure.
Because I just paid, I don't think I was treated any differently as a small business than I was at a home. I paid PacifiCorp a monthly bill based on my kilowatt hour usage.
It would depend on the rate structure that the PUCs have set up in the various states.
Right. And so the statement you just made may vary state to state then.
It's up to the individual state PUCs, the way they've set it up to protect consumers within their states.
All right. So I don't know that we have a clear answer then. It's going to, yeah, I'd yield to the ranking member.
I just want to ask, these allowances that the LDCs get, in and of themselves, they have no value. They have to sell them to get value, to give a rebate.
They could be, one way to get value would be to sell them. They could also provide them to an electricity generator as partial payment for electricity.
But if you're going to give a rebate to the consumer, you have to monetize that allowance or you can't give a rebate. Isn't that correct?
I believe that's correct.
So they sell the allowances. And whoever they sell them to, that's a cost increase. And whoever they sell them to has to pass that cost increase on in some way. Isn't that correct? Unless they sell them to the federal government.
They would not necessarily pass it through to the consumer, but they would pass through a cost if they buy the allowance, if they're able to do so.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'd like to now proceed to a vote on the Blunt Amendment. All those in favor of the Blunt Amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed, no.
Mr. Chairman,
let's go to a roll call vote.
Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingell. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher, no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. No. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Mr. Sutton. I'm sorry, Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich, aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mrs. Myrick, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no.
Have all members responded to the rule? Any member wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will tally the vote. Yes, clerk will announce the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas were 23, the nays were 30. 32. 32.
23 ayes, 32 noes. The amendment's not agreed to.